which were steep and numerous. These first two cars ventured out on the line on December 21st, 1899, thus entering Nelson into a new transportation era that would last 50 years. That half-century was filled with mishap for this small system. Just 2 days after operations began, a training and inspection run went sour. Excessive speed down the 12% grade of Kootenai Street saw the streetcar derail on the sharp curve on Hall Mines Road. The motorman lost his arm, and all others sustained cuts and bruises. In spite of this setback, streetcars were back in service on December 27th and were well patronized. In fact, support was so good that a third car was ordered early in 1900. This car was an open car for summer trade, and upon its arrival in Nelson, the Netco announced an extension of its trackage eastward to a logical site for a future park. Further extensions uphill and to the new CPR depot were laid in 1900 and 1901, and an upgrade to the power substation was made.
In their fervor to expand the initial system, the Nelson Electric Tramway Company overspent its resources and found itself in financial difficulty. By late 1900, one of the two streetcar crews had been laid off, and by early 1901, the Tramway Company decided to suspend trolley services entirely. In an effort to avert the loss of streetcars, the City of Nelson agreed to help financially, and although this kept streetcars in operation, the financial picture never really improved. By 1905, the parent British company abandoned its interests in the Nelson system, and the city stepped in to fill the void. In an effort to reduce operating costs, the two Peterborough cars and the open vestibule car were retired to the car barn, and service was carried on with the use of a single, smaller car that required only half the power and half the crew members. This remedy was quite successful until two mishaps occurred. In December of 1908, a fire completely destroyed the power substation, and 2 days following that, yet another fire destroyed the car barn and all the streetcars. By January of 1909, all that remained of Nelson's proud streetcar system was the trackage and overhead wire.
Although these losses were covered by insurance, the city was slow to act in the restoring of streetcar services. So strong, however, was the desire for a streetcar system among the population that a group of local businessmen formed the Nelson Streetcar Railway Company, and under agreement with the city undertook the reconstruction of the power substation, car barn, and the reordering of new streetcars. In February of 1910, this new company ordered two double-ended streetcars from the Ottawa Car Company and began yet another track extension project in uphill Nelson. By November 10, 1910, streetcar service was reinstituted in Nelson. True to the experience of 1899, this inaugural run was rocked by accident as well. Mr. Frank C. Ingram was superintendent of operations and was pleased to receive this promotion after spending the years from 1905 as a sometimes employed motorman. Car number 2 was to do the honors in the opening of services, and since there had been no streetcars over the trackage in some time, Mr. Ingram sent out 2 men to clear the flangeways. Car number 2 overtook these men, with Mr. Ingram and 6 others on board, on a section of Cedar Street having a grade of about 11%. Ingram decided to stop the car to allow the men to finish their work, but number 2 began to slide downhill. Efforts to bring the car to a stop failed, and number 2 slid downhill at will until derailing and landing on her side at the bottom of the 10-foot deep ravine. Most aboard were injured, but none so severely as Mr. Ingram. He suffered a compound fracture of the leg, which ultimately resulted in its being amputated. Following this accident, air brakes and sanding units were fitted on cars 1 and 2, and grade reductions and safety switches were installed as safeguards. Superintendent Ingram, after fully recuperating from his injuries, was fitted with a wooden leg and was aboard the helm of the next inaugural run of streetcars in 1911. From June of that year forward, Nelson streetcars ran 7 days a week, from 6:30 in the morning till 9 in the evening. Winter snows can be heavy at times in Nelson, So to ensure reliable winter service, a sweeper was ordered from the Ottawa Car Company. The sweeper arrived in Nelson and saw its first service on December 8, 1911.
The new streetcar company, like its predecessor, overspent itself in expanding its track routes and purchasing equipment such as the sweeper. Because public support of the system was so great, the City of Nelson once again came to the rescue, taking over all interests in the system by February of 1914. Under the management of the city, the Nelson Street Railway was once more expanded in its routes. Some 45-pound rail was upgraded to 60-pound rail, and both streetcars were overhauled. The citizens of Nelson were thrilled to have their streetcars back again.
The system thus operated very smoothly until yet another accident transpired in 1919, once again involving car number 2. At a very inopportune time, the controller in number 2 was inadvertently activated while being overhauled. The car, being in the car barn at the time, decided to nudge forward, just enough to push the sweeper out the end of the car barn to an ungracious landing some 25 feet below. Luckily, no one was hurt in this mishap, and the sweeper was repaired in quick order. By 1924, the years of use were beginning to show on the streetcars. Numbers 1 and 2 spent half their time in for repairs. It became obvious that a third car would be required if services were to be retained at their customary levels. People relied heavily on the streetcars for most of their local transportation needs. To fill this need, the city purchased a single-ended Stevenson Company car from surplus stock offered by the city of Cleveland. This car, Cleveland's number 3334, was one of the original class of 35 such cars that serviced Cleveland's earliest streetcar routes. Its incorporation into the Nelson system in 1924 required the installation of a turning loop at Lakeside Park. These would be the last tracks laid by the city. In the mid-30s, it was decided that the three-car system needed to at least sound larger than it really was. So the cars were renumbered 21, 22, and 23. Over the years, 21 and 22 saw the lion's share of duty, while number 23 was used as backup to the other two cars. By the late 1930s, the track and overhead wire were in need of costly maintenance. Council decided to offer the voters the option of scrapping their streetcar system in favor of bus operations over the same routes, but the streetcars won out. Through 1939 and 1940, many ties were replaced and new rail was laid. Operations were smooth until October of 1942, when car 22, in keeping with its character, ran away down Stanley Street. When the car arrived at the 90-degree curve onto Baker Street, she was traveling at about 20 miles per hour. Quite happily, no one sustained major injury, and property damage was relatively light. The damage to car 22 was sufficient to order its rebuild, and the roof was converted to an arch style during the rebuild. The conversion was a hit with the people of Nelson, so much so that the city decided to rebuild 21 in the same fashion. This work was completed by 1944. In July of 1945, 22 once again lost herself while traveling down Stanley Street and derailed at the same location on Baker Street. This accident was even more fortunate in that 22 was empty of passengers at the time. By 1949, the tramway system was again in need of major repair, and it was decided by referendum to abandon streetcar operations in lieu of the more modern buses. Current developments in bus design made them suitable for Nelson's steep hills. On June 20th of that year, streetcar operations came to a halt and buses roared into service that same afternoon. Cars 21 and 22 were retired on the Lakeside Park turning loop, and car 23 was purchased by the local vet to serve as a dog kennel. Doc Carney located 23 up against a dirt bank, cut holes along the length of the car, and had himself a terrific dog kennel. Cars 21 and 22 became summer cabins along Kootenay Lake, while the sweeper became a chain shack at an open-air ice arena in uphill Nelson. The trucks and other electrical and mechanical hardware from all three streetcars and the sweeper were either sold as scrap or were used as landfill along Nelson's waterfront. By 1981, the only remaining evidence of Nelson's early streetcar past was the now seriously decayed body of number 23. After serving as dog kennel for years, a concrete slab was poured into 23 and she became a tool shed, then a chicken coop, and at one time a souvenir shop and a guest house. Recognizing the historical significance of this artifact, numerous volunteers from the community rallied their support to the salvaging of this streetcar, and the new age of streetcars in Nelson was begun.